Don't call me a bad woman, she thought, letting myself fall for stolen moments and forbidden desires. Don't judge me for craving a man like David. You wouldn't understand. You wouldn't understand the tears I've cried. Susan was nearing 49, but she still possessed a youthful beauty. Anyone who saw her would think she led a charmed and happy life. But only those who lived within the walls of her home knew the truth about her troubled marriage. She'd been a successful market vendor for years, running her own dried goods stall for almost 15 years. Her hard work had brought her a comfortable life. Their children were grown, 2 of them studying in a different state, leaving Susan and Mark in their empty nest. While other folks in their small town toiled in the fields, Susan's business shielded her from the harsh sun and relentless winds. She was almost 50, but you'd never guess it. She kept up with the times. When the latest trend had taken over their town, she'd gone for a little touch-up herself. It only intensified her allure. She snatched up her sun hat and tossed it in David's direction. Mind your tongue. People can hear you, you know? They'll think there's something going on between us. Who cares? Let them talk. They don't know anything. David shrugged, unfazed. This town's full of gossip anyway. Walls have ears, as they say, but there's nothing going on, unless you want there to be. Why so serious, Susan? He added, a suggestive glint in his eyes. What's with the frown? You make a guy tired just looking at you. Oh, you think this is funny? Do you? She retorted. Your wife would love to hear about your little games. I'm sure. She's setting up her stall just like the rest of us. Imagine if she saw you flirting with me. Speaking of which, where is your better half? Probably passed out at home, right? Yeah, probably. He chuckled, clearly enjoying pushing her buttons. That's why you're so grumpy today. Huh? Old Mark hasn't given you anything to be cheerful about lately. Am I right? You look like you haven't had any fun in years. What are you talking about? Susan snapped, her face flushing. He was out drinking until late last night, and I had to set up the whole stall by myself this morning. You're one to talk. Shouldn't you be helping Linda set up instead of making eyes at me? With a mischievous grin, David strode over to Susan's stall and began to adjust the awning. Susan watched him, a mixture of annoyance and something else stirring within her. Stop it, David. People are staring. Go back to your wife. She'll claw my eyes out if she sees you here. David paused and looked at her. His eyes filled with a strange mixture of amusement and longing. He found Susan's feistiness endearing, much more so than his own rough-around-the-edges wife. They were both market folk, both familiar with the hustle and bustle of their trade. Yet there was something about Susan, a softness, a warmth that drew him to her. He'd always been smitten, even back in their younger days when they'd both been vying for her affections. He sighed inwardly. All right, I'll go, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. But I'll be back to visit you and Mark later this afternoon. Tell your old man I'm dying for a game of poker. He gave her a wink and sauntered back towards his own stall, leaving Susan to grapple with the flurry of emotions he always seemed to stir within her. As much as she wanted to deny it, she couldn't help but feel a thrill at their clandestine exchanges. If only things were different, she often mused. If only Mark was more like David, attentive, charming, full of life. But then she'd catch herself and mentally scold her reflection. It was wrong to fantasize about her husband's friend, wasn't it? Deep down, though, Susan knew she was drawn to David. If she had the chance to choose her husband again, she wouldn't hesitate to pick David over Mark. The thought of an affair with him both excited and scared her. She couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her whenever she saw him. On the surface, Susan was a strong and independent woman, but underneath it all, she was a woman who longed for love and affection, for a husband who cherished and desired her. Mark, with his drinking and gambling, was a shell of the man she'd married. He barely looked at her anymore, let alone touched her with any tenderness. Their marriage had become a loveless arrangement. Two souls sharing a home but not a life. They'd been sleeping in separate beds for years, each tending to their own needs. It was during those long, lonely nights that Susan found herself thinking about David. They ate their meals together, each tending to their own lives. It was this emptiness in her marriage that allowed David to creep into her heart. He was, after all, the one who had pursued her all those years ago. Back in their youth, David and Susan had grown up in the same town. He was a few years older and had married a woman from a neighboring town, moving in with his in-laws. Both couples ran seafood stalls at the market. Their families acquainted for as long as they could remember. They considered themselves good friends. Their wives often exchanging pleasantries and gossip about family life and raising children whenever they saw each other. Things began to change when Mark's drinking and gambling spiraled out of control. He stopped helping Susan at the market, preferring to spend his days in a drunken haze. He would show up at the market sometimes, disheveled and belligerent, even yelling insults at Susan in front of everyone. David witnessed it all, and his feelings for Susan intensified. He would finish setting up Linda's stall and then wander over to Susan's, finding excuses to lend a hand. They would chat and laugh, their interactions innocent on the surface. But underneath it all, a current of attraction simmered. David was a good man, always willing to lend a hand and offer Susan words of comfort and encouragement. But deep down, he saw her as a conquest. It wasn't her vulnerability or neediness that drew him in, it was her sheer beauty. Her magnetic presence that captivated him. He'd harbored a secret desire for her for years, a flame that refused to be extinguished. Even after all this time may have passed, but Susan only seemed to grow more beautiful, her allure tightening its grip on his heart with each passing day. The fact that she was his friend's wife only fueled his desire. Every time he looked at her, he felt a surge of longing, his eyes drinking in her every move with a potent cocktail of desire and guilt. He knew it was wrong. Friends' wives were off limits, a sacred pact among men, yet he couldn't resist the temptation. Susan was like a forbidden fruit, all the more delicious for being out of reach. He was a man of a certain age, a time when thoughts of romance and passion should have faded into the background. Yet, he'd never felt this strongly about anyone, not even Linda, back when they were newlyweds. If only his wife was as beautiful, as vibrant and captivating as Susan. If only she had an ounce of Susan's warmth and sensuality. Instead, Linda was, well, Linda, plain, bossy, with a personality as rough as sandpaper. Intimacy with her had become a chore, a wifely duty devoid of any real passion. No, it was Susan who consumed his thoughts, a delectable dish he craved with every fiber of his being. And David, ever the opportunist, would use every trick in the book to win her over. Susan knew exactly what David was after. She wasn't naive, yet, she found herself unable to sever the tie between them. The more she pushed him away, the more persistent he became. The more she tried to resist his advances, the louder her heart thumped in her chest. It wasn't just flattery or the attention. Deep down, she craved what David offered, a connection. A spark that had long since fizzled out in her own marriage. She was almost 50, yet she felt a potent energy. A yearning for intimacy that even her neglectful husband couldn't extinguish. The way she carried herself, the way her eyes sparkled with a hint of mischief, it was clear that Susan was a woman who hadn't forgotten how to enjoy life. How to crave and be craved. Mark's neglect had only amplified her need for affection, for a man's touch. Intimacy with Mark had become almost non-existent. They slept in the same bed, yet miles apart. Sometimes, the familiar ache, the longing for a man's touch would wash over her, leaving her restless and frustrated. It was during those moments that David's face would flash in her mind. His touch, his scent, a phantom limb reminding her of what she was missing. She'd bury those thoughts deep inside, ashamed and conflicted. How could she even consider such a thing? She was a married woman. For God's sake, flirting at the market wasn't enough for David. Whenever he had free time, he'd visit Susan's house, using the excuse of catching up with his old pal, Mark. His real intention, though, was to lay eyes on Mark's wife. Susan, despite her better judgment, was secretly pleased by these visits. The moment she heard a car pull up outside, she knew exactly who it was. No matter how busy she was, she'd rush inside to change into a more flattering outfit before greeting her husband's friend. She maintained a reserved and proper demeanor in front of Mark. But once his back was turned, David, a man of experience, could read between the lines. He knew from her glances and gestures that Susan was attracted to him. 2. Their circumstances didn't allow for anything more than subtle hints and longing stares. But he was sure that given the chance, she would fall into his arms in a heartbeat. So, that afternoon, David found himself heading back to their house, a wide grin plastered on his face. He carried himself with the air of a man visiting an old war buddy. But his mind was preoccupied with his friend's wife. The rumble of his truck engine echoed from the street before Susan even heard it. She'd just washed her hair and was sitting on a stool in the yard, letting the afternoon sun dry her hair. She glanced down at her clothes, satisfied with the flattering sundress she'd chosen. Well, David's voice boomed across the yard. If it isn't Susan, enjoying the breeze. Brought you some fresh shrimp, just caught this morning. Susan grimaced, raising a finger to her lips. Shush, keep your voice down, will ya? Mark's inside. Inside? David's eyebrows shot up in surprise. I figured he'd be out on a bender by now. Don't be stupid, Susan hissed, though her voice lacked any real heat. He's been at it since this morning. Probably won't surface until tomorrow. David chuckled and strode past her. Peering into the house, he spotted Mark sprawled out on the bed, eyes half open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Hey, Mark, rise and shine, you got company. How many have you had today? That's dedication for ya, he added, shaking his head in mock disapproval. Mark mumbled something unintelligible and rolled over, his back to them. Passed out drunk, Susan said, her voice flat. He polished off a whole bottle before noon. At this rate, he won't last another 5 years. She walked over to the bed and slapped her husband's shoulder. Mark, David's here. Get up and be sociable. Mark remained motionless. Don't bother. He's gone, David said with a shrug. Come on, let's have a drink. My treat. It's 5 o'clock somewhere, right? Susan shot him an irritated look. You're staying for dinner? Shouldn't you tell Linda where you are? She'll be over here breathing fire if she thinks you're up to something. Relax, Susan, David chuckled, throwing an arm around her shoulders as he steered her towards the kitchen. Don't you worry your pretty little head about Linda. I told her I was coming to play cards with Mark. Besides, he added, lowering his voice conspiratorially, wouldn't you rather have me here than with her? Just go make yourself at home, she said, shaking her head. The old man won't even know you're here. She headed out to the garden to pick some fresh vegetables for dinner. David trailing behind her. You're looking mighty fine today, Susan, he commented, his gaze lingering on her figure. Something to tell me? Don't be ridiculous, she retorted, though her lips twitched with amusement. As if I have anything to be happy about. My husband's a useless drunk. My kids are gone, and I'm stuck here slaving away. David chuckled and scooted closer to her at the table. You know, I think you're just a little love-starved, he said, his voice low and suggestive. All this pent-up frustration. Every time I try to take you out, you shoot me down. Maybe I should just stay here tonight and keep you company. Oh, stop it, David. Susan swatted his arm playfully, though her heart was racing. You know that's not funny. What will the neighbors think? Go sit over there before someone sees you. So you admit you think about me? He teased, a triumphant glint in his eyes. You wouldn't be worried about what people think otherwise. Don't flatter yourself, she said, though she couldn't hide the slight blush that crept up her cheeks. I just don't need the gossip. And for your information, I'm perfectly happy on my own. Oh, Susan, David chuckled, leaning back in his chair and giving her a knowing look. You can't fool me. Almost 50 years old and still full of fire. Mark's one lucky man. You know that? Or maybe not so lucky, he added under his breath. Susan snorted. You can have him. And while you're at it, why don't you run home and tell your wife how lucky she is? 2. She jumped up and moved to the other side of the table, putting some distance between them. But even as she did, she couldn't help but be aware of his eyes on her. Watching her every move, she cursed herself for wearing this dress. The soft cotton clinging to her curves in a way that made her hyper-aware of her own body. David's gaze followed her, his eyes lighting up. Damn, Susan, he breathed, leaning back in his chair. You're something else. I don't know how I'm going to leave here without you. Don't be absurd, David, Susan said, though her voice wavered slightly. We both have families, children. This is crazy. You need to go home to your wife. David laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. You're something else, Susan. Don't you ever change. I swear. The things you do to me, he trailed off, shaking his head. Mark doesn't know how good he has it. I'd give anything to have you for myself. Even just for one night. Don't talk like that, Susan scolded, though she couldn't help but feel a thrill run through her at his words. He was right, she thought. Mark wouldn't know what to do with a woman like her. A woman who still craved passion. Still had fire in her veins. She picked up the basket of vegetables and headed back to the kitchen. her hips swaying slightly with each step. David watched her go, his eyes glued to her every move. "Go on, David, have a seat inside," she said over her shoulder. "I'll call you when dinner's ready." "Don't mind if I do," he replied, his eyes twinkling. "Besides, a pretty lady shouldn't be left alone in the kitchen." He followed her, unable to resist being near her. "You know, I always see you at the market. And I just want to come over and say hello," he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "But Linda's always hovering. It's like she knows." "Maybe she does," Susan said with a sly smile. "If only she was half the woman you are." He sighed, shaking his head. "I got a raw deal. Marrying that one. No offense. None taken." Susan laughed, picking up a knife and starting to chop vegetables. "I bet you were quite the heartbreaker back in the day," David continued, leaning against the counter, watching her every move. "I mean, look at you. If I had a dime for every guy who fell for those eyes." Susan shot him a sidelong glance, her heart fluttering at his words. His compliments brought back memories of their youth, when he had pursued her relentlessly. His attentions both flattering and overwhelming. She'd chosen Mark in the end, drawn to his quiet charm and good family background. Now, looking at David, his strong arms and mischievous grin, she couldn't help but wonder if she'd made the wrong choice all those years ago. "Don't you go digging up old ghosts, David," she said softly. "That's all in the past. Some things are worth digging up," he said, his voice husky with emotion. He reached out and brushed his fingers against hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "David, don't," she whispered, pulling her hand away. "What if someone sees?" "Let them see," he murmured, his eyes burning into hers. "Just one kiss, Susan. That's all I ask. You can't tell me you haven't thought about it." "You're impossible," she said, her voice a breathless whisper. "Get out of here before I scream." David threw back his head and roared with laughter, clearly enjoying their little game. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "So, tell me, Susan," he whispered, "how long has it been since Mark, you know?" She knew exactly what he was asking. "That's none of your business," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Poor Susan," he said softly, his hand reaching out to cup her cheek. "I bet you don't even remember what it's like to be with a real man." Before Susan could protest, he pulled her into his arms, his lips crashing down on hers. She froze for a split second, her mind reeling from the shock of it all. But as his kiss deepened, her body betraying her better judgment, she felt a wave of longing wash over her, a primal urge that she hadn't felt in years. This was wrong, all wrong, yet she couldn't bring herself to push him away. "David, stop it," she finally gasped, pushing him back. "What if Mark wakes up?" David chuckled, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of amusement and something darker, more possessive. "He's out for the count. Honey, don't worry about him." "No, David, I mean it. This is crazy. Go upstairs before someone sees us." He took a step back, his gaze still fixed on her. All right, he said, his voice husky. "But just one more for the road?" He leaned in and gave her another quick kiss, his lips lingering on hers just long enough to send another shiver down her spine. "One more wouldn't hurt, would it?" He winked. "You're so beautiful, Susan. I can't resist you. You're crazy. Go on, get upstairs. What if Mark wakes up?" "He won't. I'll keep him occupied tonight. Don't you worry." He gave her a final squeeze and headed back upstairs, leaving Susan to clean up the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't understand herself. She should be furious, should be throwing pots and pans at him. Instead, she found herself leaning against the counter, a silly grin plastered on her face. There was something thrilling, intoxicating about David's advances, about the way he made her feel desired. She'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be wanted, to feel a man's touch send shivers down her spine. It was wrong, she knew that, but a small, rebellious part of her couldn't help but crave more. Susan finished washing the dishes, her mind a whirlwind of confusing emotions. She was almost 50 years old. For God's sake, what was she doing, letting her husband's best friend put his hands on her like that? It was madness, and yet, she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was changing within her. Something exciting and terrifying all at once. She was a woman on the verge of, what? An awakening? A breakdown? She remembered a time, years ago, when intimacy with Mark had been easy, natural. Back then, She'd reveled in his touch, in the way he made her feel like the only woman in the world. But the years, the drinking, the constant disappointments had taken their toll. Now, even the memory of their lovemaking seemed like a distant dream, a faded photograph of a life that no longer existed. She took a deep breath and finished setting the table, trying to push away the images flooding her mind. David's hands on her waist, his lips on hers. It was wrong. She knew that. She should be repulsed by his behavior, by his blatant disregard for her husband. But instead, she felt excited, and more than a little bit terrified. Dinner with David and Mark was a strained affair. Mark, true to form, was well on his way to oblivion, his laughter loud and boisterous, his words slurring together. Susan and David exchanged secret glances across the table, a silent communication passing between them that was both thrilling and dangerous. David kept Mark's glass full, plying him with stories and jokes, his true motive clear. Susan watched him, torn between wanting him to leave and wanting him to stay. She excused herself and went to freshen up, splashing cool water on her face and changing into a loose-fitting blouse. She caught her reflection in the mirror and was startled by the blush that warmed her cheeks, the unusual sparkle in her eyes. David stretched his leg out under the table, his foot brushing against Susan's leg. She couldn't help but giggle, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of amusement and something more dangerous. She shook her head, mouthing, "Stop it," at him. But her heart wasn't in it. Deep down, she loved his playful touches, the way he made her feel desired. Dinner stretched on for almost an hour, David expertly keeping Mark plied with drinks. Finally, Mark slumped over in his chair, snoring softly. This was it, the opportunity David had been waiting for. He helped Mark to his feet and guided him towards the bedroom, shooting Susan a triumphant look over his shoulder. She quickly cleared the table, her heart pounding in her chest. This was insane. She couldn't believe what she was about to do. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, his eyes dark with desire. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her close. "Mark's out cold," he whispered in her ear, his voice husky. "We're all alone now." Susan's knees almost buckled at his touch. "David, we can't," she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" he murmured against her skin, his hands moving to cup her breasts. "Don't you want this, Susan? I know you do." "David, please," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't do this. What about Linda? What about Mark? This is wrong." "Shush," he said, silencing her protests with a kiss. "Don't think, just feel. I've been waiting for this for years. Susan, years. You have no idea how much I want you." He kissed her again, his hands moving over her body with a possessiveness that sent shivers down her spine. Part of her wanted to fight him, to push him away and tell him to leave. But her body was betraying her. She hadn't felt this alive, this desired in years. "David, please," she breathed, her voice trembling. "I need to clean up." Her words seemed to snap him out of his daze. He let out a shaky breath and stepped back, reluctantly releasing her. All right, he mumbled, running a hand through his hair. "But I'm not leaving without you tonight. Susan, you hear me?" He leaned in and inhaled the scent of her hair, a look of pure adoration on his face. Then, with a final lingering glance, he turned and headed back upstairs. Susan stood frozen in place, her head spinning. She needed time to think, to process what had just happened. But her body thrummed with a need that she couldn't ignore, a need that David had awakened within her. 15 minutes later, she tiptoed up the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She peered into the bedroom where Mark lay snoring peacefully. Taking a deep breath, she went to find David. "You still here?" she asked softly, her hand on the doorknob. "It's late, David, you should go." But even as she said the words, she knew he wouldn't leave. "Come here," he said, holding out his hand. He pulled her into the room, his eyes burning with a passion that both excited and terrified her. "David, what are you doing?" she whispered, her heart racing. "Mark could wake up any minute." "He won't," David said, pulling her close. "I checked. He's out cold. Tonight, you're all mine, Susan, just like you should be." "This is insane," she murmured, but there was no real force behind her words. "Insane? Maybe," he chuckled, his voice rough with desire. "But it's gonna be the best damn crazy you've ever felt. I promise you that." "But what about Linda?" Susan whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of guilt and desire. What if she finds out? She won't, David said confidently, his hands moving over her body with a familiarity that made her breath catch in her throat. Don't you worry your pretty little head about Linda. Tonight, it's just you and me. But David, shush. He silenced her with a kiss. 10 o'clock. That's all I ask. Then I'll sneak out. But if you send me away now. Susan, I swear, I don't think my heart could handle it. You're serious, aren't you? Susan whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and excitement. If I let you stay, I won't be able to resist you. I know myself. She felt like she was losing her mind. Just yesterday, she had been a respectable woman, a faithful wife. Now, here she was, about to betray everything she held dear for a few stolen moments with her husband's best friend. If it was any other man, she might be able to rationalize it. But David, he was practically family. They'd shared holidays, birthday parties, countless dinners together. Logic warred with the raw need that pulsed through her veins. A need that had been ignored for far too long. In the end, her desire for David, for a night of passion and reckless abandon, overrode all her doubts. David, I'm scared, she whispered, letting him lead her towards her bedroom. This feels so wrong. David stopped and pulled her close, his eyes searching hers. It feels right to me. Susan, he murmured, his voice husky. Believe me, it does. He kissed her then, silencing her doubts with a passion that ignited a fire within her. She kissed him back, her hands tangling in his hair, her fear melting away with every touch. Wait, she whispered, suddenly pulling away. We have to make sure Mark's really asleep. If he wakes up, don't worry, he won't, David assured her, though he sounded slightly out of breath himself. I'll double check. He crept down the hallway and peeked into Mark's room. Susan watched him, her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of guilt and anticipation washing over her. She couldn't believe this was actually happening. David returned a moment later, a mischievous grin on his face. Out cold, he whispered. Come on. He pulled her into her bedroom, closing the door softly behind them. Susan flicked off the light switch, leaving only the dim glow of the bedside lamp illuminating the room. David wasted no time, his lips finding hers in the darkness. His kiss was hungry, desperate, and Susan found herself responding in kind. She'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be touched like this. To have a man desire her with such intensity. At first, she was shy, hesitant, unsure of how to move her body against his. But David was a masterful lover. His hands guiding her, urging her on, his touch ignited a fire within her, her inhibitions melting away with each passing moment. They moved together then, their bodies entwined, lost in a world of their own making. The years melted away, the weight of her marriage, the guilt, the fear, it all faded into the background as she surrendered to the pleasure that consumed her. This wasn't like the perfunctory lovemaking she'd shared with Mark in recent years. This was something else entirely. Something primal, exhilarating, and dangerous. This was wrong. She knew that. She was committing a sin. Betraying her husband in the most intimate way possible. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to care. All she could think about was the feel of David's skin against hers. The taste of his lips. The way he moved within her, making her feel like a woman again. God, Susan, David groaned, his voice husky with passion. You're incredible, so beautiful, so responsive. His words ignited a fire within her, a need to please, to prove that she was everything he'd ever wanted in a woman. She met his every thrust, her own passion building, spiraling out of control. I could get used to this, David murmured against her skin, his hands moving over her body with a possessiveness that sent shivers down her spine. In fact, screw getting used to it, I think I could fall in love with you. Susan, I swear it. David didn't need words to tell him how much Susan had enjoyed herself. He could feel it in the way she responded to his touch. The soft moans that escaped her lips as he made love to her. If there was a next time, he thought, it would be Susan who initiated it. This was only the beginning. He was the second man she'd ever been with. But he'd be the one she'd never forget. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. Don't worry about a thing, Susan, he murmured, his voice thick with contentment. I'll take care of everything. He chuckled softly. You're something else, you know that? All those years, who knew you had it in you? David, don't, Susan whispered, her cheeks burning with shame. We can't ever do this again. I was just caught up in the moment. What if someone finds out? What if Linda? Shush. He silenced her with a kiss. Don't overthink it. What happens between us, it's our little secret. Nobody else needs to know. He grinned. Besides, I kinda like sneaking around. Makes it more exciting, don't you think? Susan swatted his arm playfully, though her heart was racing. You're incorrigible, she said, shaking her head. If Linda ever found out. She shuddered at the thought. She won't, David assured her, his voice confident. I'm a pro at this. Remember? Just keep your voice down. And we'll be fine. He glanced at the clock on the nightstand. Speaking of which, I should probably get going. The old ball and chain might get suspicious if I'm gone too long. He gave her one last kiss. A lingering, possessive gesture that left her wanting more. Then, with a wink and a mischievous grin, he slipped out of bed and started getting dressed. David left Susan's house that night feeling like a new man. He'd fantasized about this moment for years. Had practically worn a path in the pavement between his house and Susan's. All for this chance encounter. And it had been even better than he imagined. Susan, at 49, was even more desirable than the young woman he'd pined for all those years ago. Susan, meanwhile, lay awake long after David had left, her mind replaying the events of the evening in vivid detail. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so alive, so desired, so utterly reckless. She'd crossed a line, broken a sacred trust, and yet, a part of her couldn't find the will to regret it. The next morning at the market, their eyes met across the crowded stalls. Susan felt a blush creep up her neck as she remembered their encounter. To her surprise, she was the one seeking him out now, her gaze lingering on him just a moment longer than necessary. She was a different woman than she'd been yesterday. Bolder, more confident. The guilt was still there, but it was overshadowed by a thrilling sense of anticipation, a need for something more. David, ever the charmer, didn't disappoint. He flirted openly with Susan whenever Linda wasn't looking, their hands brushing against each other as they exchanged goods, their laughter a secret language only they understood. They made plans for their next rendezvous, carefully mapping out their schedules to find moments they could steal away together. Thus began their dangerous affair. David would visit Susan's house too, sometimes 3 times a week, their encounters becoming increasingly brazen. On the days when Mark was sober enough to notice, they'd sneak off to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. Their passion a potent drug that both intoxicated and terrified them. Susan, once a respectable wife and mother, found herself addicted to David, to the way he made her feel desired. Alive, she was playing with fire. She knew that, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. She was like a moth drawn to a flame, knowing it could burn her, yet powerless to resist its allure. She was living a double life. Her outward appearance a carefully constructed facade that hid the truth of her desires. Little did she know that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around her. Mark, meanwhile, remained oblivious to his wife's infidelity, lost in a haze of cheap whiskey. He was barely aware of his surroundings, let alone the fact that his wife was sleeping with his best friend under his own roof. As the weeks turned into months, Susan became more and more brazen in her affair with David. She stopped caring who saw them together at the market, her laughter echoing a little too loudly whenever he was around. She poured all her energy into looking her best for him, her appearance transforming from that of a respectable housewife to something altogether more alluring. The fear of getting caught was always there, but it was overshadowed by her desire for David, by the intoxicating feeling of being wanted. Desired. She'd convinced herself that she deserved this, that after years of neglect, she was entitled to a little happiness, even if it came at a price. The thought of David growing tired of her, of him finding someone else to satisfy his needs, filled her with a terror she couldn't shake. Their affair might have continued indefinitely if David hadn't been so careless. He'd grown bolder over time, his visits to Susan's stall becoming more frequent, his touches more possessive. The other vendors started to notice, their whispers turning into knowing glances and hushed conversations. Why doesn't she just stay at her own stall? One of the women muttered to another. Her eyes narrowed as she watched David sling an arm around Susan's shoulders. It's like she wants everyone to know. Her poor husband, another woman sighed, shaking her head. He seems like such a nice man, too. Such a shame. Word eventually reached Linda. She'd heard the rumors before, of course, David's wandering eye was no secret in their small town, but she'd always brushed them aside, choosing to believe that he would never betray her so openly. This time, though, the rumors were too persistent, too specific to ignore. She confronted David about it, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. "They say you're always over at Susan's stall," she said, her eyes boring into his. They say? She couldn't bring herself to repeat the accusations, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air between them. David brushed off her concerns, his tone nonchalant, almost bored. "Don't be ridiculous, Linda," he scoffed. "You know how people talk. They're just jealous. Susan and I are just friends. Besides," he added, his voice softening slightly, "you know how Mark likes his liquor. Someone needs to keep an eye on him at the market." Linda wanted to believe him, but a seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing rapidly. She decided to confront Susan directly. "David tells me he's been spending a lot of time at your stall," she said, her voice deceptively calm. Susan's hand trembled as she arranged a display of dried herbs. "Oh, that," she said, forcing a laugh. "He's just being a good friend. Looking out for Mark. You know how he gets." Linda looked at her, her gaze unwavering. "Susan," she said softly, "I'm not stupid. I know what's going on." For a moment, Susan thought about denying it, about coming up with a plausible explanation for David's behavior. But looking into Linda's eyes, she knew she couldn't keep up the charade any longer. Their affair continued, fueled by a dangerous mix of desire and defiance. They were playing with fire, and they both knew it, but neither of them seemed willing, or able, to stop. Their recklessness ultimately proved to be their undoing. One rainy December afternoon, David went to Susan's house, using the pretense of checking on Mark, who was supposedly laid up with a cold. They were in the throes of passion, oblivious to the world outside, when the bedroom door flew open and Linda stormed in, her face contorted with rage. Standing behind her, their eyes wide with shock and disgust, were David's two daughters. What followed was a scene of pure chaos. Linda, fueled by a rage she didn't know she possessed, launched herself at Susan, her screams echoing through the small house. She was a woman scorned, and she was going to make both her husband and his lover pay. David's pleas for reason fell on deaf ears. He tried to pull Linda off Susan, but she was like a woman possessed, her nails raking, her teeth bared. His daughters stood frozen in the doorway, their faces pale with shock and disgust, as they watched their father's infidelity and their mother's pain unfold before their very eyes. Linda, used to the rough and tumble life of a market vendor, was no stranger to a good brawl. But this was different. This was personal. She grabbed Susan by her hair, pulling her to the ground. Susan's carefully styled hair, her pride and joy, was torn apart, her face scratched and bruised. Years of pent-up anger and resentment poured out of Linda, her blows landing with a satisfying thud against Susan's flesh. By the time David finally managed to pull Linda off her, Susan was a sobbing, shaking mess. Her clothes were ripped, her face covered in scratches, and her hair, once her crowning glory, was scattered across the bedroom floor. Linda stood over her, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You home-wrecking whore," she spat, her voice thick with disgust. "I ought to kill you both." Then, with one final withering look, she stormed out of the house, her daughters trailing behind her, their faces etched with a mixture of shame and anger. The news of Susan's infidelity spread through the town like wildfire. Linda made sure of it. She plastered Susan's picture all over the market, along with a detailed account of her affair with David. Susan became a pariah overnight, the target of gossip and scorn. The whispers followed her everywhere she went, the judging eyes burning into her back like hot coals. She stopped going to the market after that, too ashamed to face her friends and neighbors. She became a recluse in her own home, her once vibrant life reduced to a shadow of its former self. She'd been shunned by her community, branded a scarlet woman, and the weight of her sin was almost unbearable. She ended up moving to a different town, unable to face the shame and judgment that awaited her in the only place she'd ever called home. As for Mark, the reality of his wife's betrayal hit him hard. He'd always known, deep down, that he wasn't the best husband. His drinking, his gambling, his general indifference towards Susan, he knew he'd driven her away. But he never thought she'd seek solace in the arms of another man, let alone his best friend. The knowledge of their betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow. And he sought solace at the bottom of a bottle. His despair and anger drowning in cheap whiskey. He started hitting Susan then, blaming her for his pain, for the shattered remains of their marriage. But Susan endured his blows in silence, accepting his rage as a just punishment for her sins. She would live with the consequences of her choices for the rest of her days. A constant reminder of the price of infidelity, of the devastating power of secrets and lies. It was a harsh lesson, but one she would never forget.